Today, we're learning the ropes on Dragonpriests. What are they? When should you fight them? And how can you beat them? Let's jump right in. So Dragonpriests are undead enemies hidden across ancient tombs, word walls, and burial grounds. These are not your average bandit-style enemies, nor are they your average Draugr-style enemies. These are late-game enemies. Remember that these were priests appointed by dragons themselves to rule over Skyrim, and in many cases, they are older than dust itself. Something common among these enemies is they tend to have powerful, unique weapons as they are late-game enemies. Typically, they have something sort of a mask, or in some cases, due to the quest lines, you can find bags of holding and similar things. They also tend to have fairly large health pools, so they're relatively tanky. And the hard part about them is they have an 80 health regen per second, and if you hit them with fire damage, they're still going to regenerate health. It's just they only regenerate 40 instead of 80. Now, because of this particularly, they are typically going to be very difficult for mage style players. So even when you think you're at the appropriate level, you have to remember that because your damage is more regenerative in the sense that it has to pause for quite a bit while you regenerate the magicka you spent, it is very difficult because in that same instance, they're going to be regenerating pretty much all of their health back. So as a common rule, you're going to need to be able to take them out in one foul swoop. Now, they also have a 50 magicka regen per second, making enchantments such as spell breaking from the enchanting perk tree very useful because it will drain all of their magicka when it decides to tick. They also have a natural 10% magic resistance, 30% magicka absorption, and a natural 240 armor rating. To bolster this further, they almost always will have some sort of alteration spell that they can use to even further buff their armor rating, such as Mage Armor 4. They also have a natural resistance to frost damage by 90%, shock damage by 85%, and fire by 50%. They also have a number of perks that bolster their other abilities, such as Priest Mage Armor, which makes any mage armor that they cast on themselves much more useful. They've also got Cognitive Flexibility, which allows them to summon 2 Daedra at once. If that wasn't bad enough, when you go to summon your own Daedra, they also have Command Daedra, which will then just turn yours against you. Also, they can summon another Dragon Priest as a common rule, which then gives them another huge nuisance for you to deal with. They can also have a number of deadly spells to ruin your day based off of their variant type. There's typically going to be 3 variants, which is Frost, Shock, and Fire. So Frost has Ice Spear, Ice Storm, and Frost Cloak spells, and they also summon Frost Atronachs. Of course, they've also got perks that increase the damage for these spells with the chance to freeze susceptible enemies such as your followers. Now the fire version has Fireball, Incinerate, and Flame Cloak, and they of course can summon Flame Atronachs. Their perks increase their overall fire damage and then cause enemies to run in fear. Lastly, Shock has Chain Lightning, Thunderbolt, and Lightning Cloak, and then of course they can summon Storm Atronachs. Now, because of the way that Wildlander currently works, it's sort of a rock, paper, scissors. Two-handed characters actually have the best build against these types of enemies due to their heavy burst damage from hard hits. As I mentioned earlier, mages tend to have a very difficult time with these types of enemies due to their lower damage per second and then having to fight against the health regeneration constantly. If you happen to be using restoration spells, I recommend getting Sunfire Cloak and dual casting Sunburst, which are useful since they are built specifically to target undead enemies such as these. Of course, fire-based spells are another great option, one because they stunt the health regeneration, and they tend to only have a 50% resistance to fire, which again makes this the best choice. Sword and board builds have the hardest time against these enemies because they have less burst damage and their shield not really benefiting them all that much in terms of additional damage or resistance. Someone did point out in my Guide to Vampires video that Flame Burst gets old really fast due to the explosive impact blinding you with use. I agree that generally it's an annoying enchantment. However, if you're having trouble with the Dragon Priest, I would recommend using the Flame Burst spell in this instance, as it has a higher fire damage output, which helps to compensate for your lack of burst damage, typically accompanied by one-handed weapon users. Now, some honorable mentions for one-handed weapons are the Axe of Whiterun and the Dawnguard Rune War Axe. So if you join the Dawnguard, you get the Rune War Axe pretty much right away. This weapon's a great option because it's made of silver, which increases its efficacy against undead, and after slaying 90 undead, it increases the sun damage up to 100 damage, making this a great option. Dawnbreaker will always be the best option for taking on undead enemies, for what I would consider to be obvious reasons. Quickly running through it, it does extra damage to undead enemies, 50 fire damage with every single hit, and has a 2% chance to deal 2,500 damage to all nearby enemies, undead or not. As with all magic-based enemies, I recommend enchanting your gear with magic resistance based off of their variation if you can, to accommodate their magic type they will be dishing out. Similarly, I recommend choosing perks that help increase your magic resistance, such as Elemental Protection from the Blocking Tree, which has a 50% negation to all incoming elemental damage. The 3 improved Mage Armor options, which will work their way up to 30% resistance to hostile magic effects. And then if you happen to be running wards, there are several perks there that can be used to either absorb magic, or to just simply reduce the damage you take overall. Now, there are special Dragon Priests such as Mordecai, Azidel, and Dukan. They typically have over twice as much health. They're stronger versions of whatever damage type spells, such as Wall of Frost, Wall of Flames, ability to summon a stronger version of the Atronachs, or an even greater ward. They also have the ability to expel Daedra, even the strongest Daedra that you can produce. They have immunity to the damage from their specialized damage type, so for instance, if you're fighting one that happens to be flame, you will not want to use fire damage against them because they will just take 0 damage, and some of them can have even 3 summons active at the same time. The TLDR for these special Dragon Priests is
foes beyond
that if you're having a difficult time with their lower strength counterparts, these are definitely going to be beyond your level. I would say until you can somewhat confidently take on the basic Dragon Priests, these guys will be nigh unkillable. Often you won't be able to make a dent in their health, period. Now remember, the big important thing here is these are late game enemies that are meant to be fought as your build begins to be more fleshed out and you're no longer an even average or even above average adventurer. You're kind of becoming on the lengths of a god himself. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, leave a like, consider subscribing. Stay safe, Wildlanders.